So, what are the 10 things compliance officers need to do in 2020? Who better to ask than Susannah Hammond, Senior Regulatory Intelligence Expert at Thomson Reuters. Very nice to see you again, Susannah. I'm looking through your notes. Continuing regulatory change is at the top here. Now, you know, for the layperson like myself, I would say haven't the big set regulatory pieces already happened, and we can just sort of not worry so much more about that?
The very short answer to that question is yes, but then of course it comes with a but. Because big things like the original MiFID, Dodd-Frank and so on, they've all pretty much landed. What's happening now is we're into that iteration of, well, we've done all these great big changes, but are the changes actually working as intended? And so the Financial Stability Board, which, as you know, works under the aegis of the G20, is having an assessment phase saying, we've had all of this regulatory reform, is it actually doing what we intended it to do? So we're now entering into this iteration of reviewing it. Is it working in practice? And now that means several things. One, obviously the regulators are involved. But the sharp end practical thing is the firms are involved. The firms are going to have to respond to information requests from regulators. The firms are going to have to engage again on consultation. Is that working? Does this work? Where do we need to do something different? But then, of course, you've got jurisdictions like Australia, where the Royal Commission last year proposed, nigh on 100 reforms. So they're entering another phase of the cycle of regulatory change.
I guess the theme must be constant adaptation to regulatory change, and that almost needs to become part of business now, doesn't it? It's not a one-off here and a one-off there.
Absolutely.
You need to live and breathe
and when you do regulatory changes and implement them into your systems, you need to do that on a basis that is flexible. So it's not a one and done, and therefore it's all hardwired and we can't change anything else ever again. It's, well, these are the current set of rules. Let's make sure that our infrastructure, whether that's your control infrastructure, IT infrastructure, your approach to risk and compliance, is sufficiently flexible that you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time things change. But a key part of all of this is that firms have to engage with the regulators. I mean, bad or poorly thought through regulation, it suits nobody.
Okay, transaction reporting issues. What are firms still doing badly or getting wrong?
We may have talked about this once or twice before. Transaction reporting is important, and I know it is a boring administrative detail that firms just see as another cost of doing regulated business, but it's crucially important for the regulators themselves, not only so they can see the markets, but also it's their major mechanism for identifying and tracking market abuse. So it's a core requirement for regulators around the world, basically to know what's going on in the marketplaces. Now, UBS and Goldman's here in the UK both got fined around 30 million quid last year for getting it wrong again. And that's getting it wrong again under the original MiFID, so MiFID 1, which is a decade old now, give or take. And the root cause appears to have been poor project implementation. So we're back to the regulatory change. Please, could you do it right first time? And there are so many lessons in there for firms to get your project management right for regulatory change. And there is an absolute warning in there as well that, under MiFID 1, you got it wrong repeatedly, firms. MiFID 2, MiFIR, no one's yet been taken to task for getting transaction reporting wrong under that set of rules. But given the number of warnings, given the number of fines, I think there will be no leniency from the regulators if people get it wrong again.
Okay. You focus on lobbying. Concerns it seems to have worked too well. What do compliance officers need to watch in this space?
The working too well bit comes from an IMF report, International Monetary Fund report, on US banks specifically. And they are very, very clear that the empirical evidence shows that there has been regulatory capture. And what that means is that there are less strict rules and requirements put in place. The fines imposed aren't as big as they should be. And should a bailout be required, more monies are forthcoming. Now, that's a pretty damning trio. Now, absolutely, lobbying in the US is a whole different ballgame to everywhere else in the world. That doesn't change the fact the IMF has just spun a very big spotlight on lobbying.
Okay.
Now, lobbying does work in the sense that it is a very proactive way for firms to engage with regulators, with politicians, and all of the rest of it. But you have to walk that line where you don't step over and regulation becomes something that benefits the firms, pretty much to the exclusion of the customers.
But is it very much a US issue?
It is, but because it's a US issue that's had a spotlight shone on it, there will be spotlights shone elsewhere around the world, I am absolutely sure.
Okay. Finally, the Cost of Compliance Report 2019, which you and I have spoken about at length, found that 28% of firms have outsourced some or all of the compliance function. What are we going to hear now about outsourcing as we move forward? Well,
there have been rather too many fines again about outsourcing and firms' really inability to control what has been outsourced. Just because you've outsourced something doesn't mean that responsibility goes away for you. Almost the opposite. You have to be even more vigilant that what is happening in those outsourced activities. Now, the reasons given in the Cost of Compliance report for the outsourcing were a need for additional in-house assurance as to the compliance processes, fine. A lack of in-house skills, we'll come back to that one, and then cost. If you are persistently outsourcing because you have a lack of in-house risk and compliance skills, I would suggest you need to look very closely at what you're doing. I mean, you have to have sufficient in-house skills to manage the business you're doing. Sure, compliance activities can be outsourced, but don't outsource them persistently because you can't do it in-house from a skill set perspective. You may do it because it's economically more viable. You may do it for other reasons, like language, for instance. Don't do it persistently if you've got a lack of skills. Invest in those skills.
Okay. Very good. So those are some of the 10 things that compliance officers need to keep an eye out for in 2020. For more details, take a look at the website. The address, there you go, is on the screens. That's it from me. I'm Axel Threlfall. This is Reuters.